Just under 30 years ago, the WNBA only had 8 teams, and every franchise had an NBA counterpart. This gave the new league a lot more brand recognition than any other new league would have just to be starting out. But since then, the league's landscape has gone through so many changes where some of the original 8 teams either weathered the storm and stayed put, have gone through a handful of relocations, or just flat out don't exist anymore. But in 2025, the W is starting to see some of its highest highs. And with the recent announcement of even more expansion teams, the league's history of expansion and relocation just got even more wild. My name is Caleb, and expansion and relocation can be exciting for any league, but I think that's especially the case for the WNBA. By 2030, the W is going to have 18 teams, and as the league continues to grow, I'm positive that there will even be more over the next decade. There were certain points in the league's history where it looked like some teams' existence wouldn't even make it this far, while others unfortunately didn't have the same fate. From the beginning of the W to the very near future, let's talk about each era of WNBA expansion and relocation. The very first WNBA season in 1997 saw the league open play with its 8 original teams, all being sister teams to their NBA counterparts in the same cities. If they didn't already have names that were in the family of an NBA team, they were sure to have a similar color scheme for better brand recognition and to attract already established fan bases within the league. Small, medium, and large markets were all covered, and for the original 8 teams, it was a good sample size to start the league off. And come year 2 in 1998, the league would see its first expansion, adding 2 new teams to the league, bringing its total to 10. Detroit and Washington were ideal to become the latest WNBA cities, as their NBA counterparts were both kind of going through transitional periods at the time of their founding. The Detroit Shock, named to honor Detroit's automotive history by referencing shock absorbers in cars, the owners also wanted a strong but feminine name to represent the women who were going to be representing Detroit's latest pro sports team. The Washington Mystics founding is directly related to the Wizards. They were named in part to keep the sorcery theme going, but also started their first year as a team with a league worst 3-27 record. Expansion teams are not always going to start out the best, as neither the Shock or Mystics would see the playoffs in their first seasons. The league would keep expanding in 1999 for the second straight season, adding teams and cities that had relatively new NBA history. The Magic and Timberwolves had only just been founded in the late 80s, and not even a decade later, Orlando and Minnesota were getting another professional basketball team. While yes, the Lynx are similar in name to the Timberwolves, they were actually named in tribute to Minnesota's Native American history. To many indigenous communities, the Lynx represents strength, power, independence, something the Lynx were looking to represent as a team. 1999's other expansion team was the Orlando Miracle, and while their name doesn't have a direct reference to their location, it was actually chosen in an essay contest held by the Orlando Sentinel newspaper. The writer of the essay, Hannah Taggart, wanted a team name to represent the progress that women's sports had made to that point, and also, like the Magic, were an indirect reference to Orlando's Walt Disney World. Like their expansion mates before them, the Lynx and Miracle would both miss the playoffs in their inaugural season, but the W was making progress in new markets and setting up women's pro hoops in the US to finally have a league that sticks, after so many before them had folded pretty quickly. The new millennium was going to give the W its biggest expansion yet, but would see so many of its original teams move around or shut down operations completely. 2000 saw women's basketball make its way to Indiana, Miami, Seattle, and Portland, and the league was more than halfway there to their brother league's team total at 16. More teams meant more roster spots, and moving to other established NBA cities meant even more fans. The Indiana Fever was really the first team in NBA history that had a name that didn't really relate to their NBA counterpart. How do you go from Pacers to Fever? Well, apparently they were named for Indiana's attitude towards basketball, and as someone from Indiana, the name makes perfect sense. We're the basketball state, no further explanation needed. The Miami Soul are also pretty self-explanatory. It typically gets hot in Miami, Soul is Spanish for sun, and a play on the Miami Heat's name. Ironically, it would be the first of 2 WNBA teams to technically have sun as their nickname, but we'll get to that other team in just a bit. The Seattle Storm were named for the city's constant rainy weather, and original team president Karen Bryant said, "It's the perfect name because of the weather here and what the team plans to do in the league." And then we have the Portland Fire, whose team name I actually couldn't find too much history about. I guess you can kind of see the similarities between the Blazers and the Fire, but aside from that, there wasn't too much out there about not only their team history, but why they were called the Fire in the first place. Nonetheless, the league would reach 16 teams, but that wouldn't last very long whatsoever. In 2002, the WNBA's new restructuring agreement laid the burden of paying player salaries and finding corporate sponsors to individual teams. In a very obviously expensive move, the Miami Soul couldn't afford to continue operations, and the 2002 WNBA season would be their last. And they weren't alone in shutting down shop, as the Portland Fire would also fold after the 2002 season. The Fire's short existence can be drawn back to the league transitioning ownership to their NBA counterparts or a third party, where originally each team was owned by the NBA itself. Then Blazers owner Paul Allen did not want to take on the team's financial losses, and despite an ownership push from a third party group led by Blazers legend Clyde Drexler, the team would ultimately get the short end of the stick despite improving in their last WNBA season. Just 2 years into their existence, two of the newest teams in the league just didn't exist anymore. It was unfortunate, but pretty normal for a super young league to lose teams along the way. The Soul and Fire weren't the only teams to have short-lived existences though. The 2003 season had the most moves in terms of franchises up to that point in the league's history. One of the league's original teams would fold, another original team would relocate, and one of the league's first expansion teams would also find themselves in a new city. 2003 saw the end of the Cleveland Rockers franchise. They were purchased by the Gunn family after the league sold their teams to their NBA counterparts, and it seemed as if the Rockers were here to stay. The Gunn family had owned the Cavs since the early 80s, and even though there hadn't been too many great Cavs teams in that time, the Rockers had put together a handful of decent seasons, including a few playoff runs. Sports have a funny way of working sometimes because putting out good teams doesn't always guarantee success in other areas. Despite some success, they had some of the lowest attendance in the league and weren't making any money. It didn't help that the Cavs also weren't good at that time, but their fortunes changed a bit that previous summer. The Gunn family declined to operate the team anymore, and when the league couldn't find another owner, it was wraps for the Rockers. The Rockers were the first founding team to make a move that significant and fold, and the Utah Stars would be next. Their fate, though, would see them moving from Salt Lake City to San Antonio. The Stars were almost victim to the NBA's divestment from the league, as the Utah Jazz ownership didn't want to retain ownership of their sister team. Thankfully for the franchise, then Spurs owner Peter Holt would step in and save the team from folding, but he moved them out of Utah immediately and slightly tweaked the team name. The Stars had only made the playoffs twice in 7 years and were going to turn a new leaf in San Antonio. The formerly known Utah Stars with 2 Z's were now the San Antonio Silver Stars with no Z's. Named for the star on the Texas state flag, the silver was also to match the color scheme of the Spurs. Almost every other team we'll be covering today has made multiple moves in some capacity, whether it's folding, relocation, or a simple name change, but the Orlando Miracle are an interesting case. As one of the first expansion teams in the league, the team was another victim of the NBA's divestment, and the Magic owners at the time did not want the Miracle. Another ownership group search was launched, and the Mohegan tribe of Connecticut were the winning bidders, and the team was theirs. It's a really underrated move in sports history, as they were the first Native American tribe to own a professional sports team. They moved the team to the New England region and become the Connecticut Sun, named after the Mohegan Sun Casino, where they also play at the Mohegan Sun Arena. I think people forget that the Sun at one point were the Orlando Miracle since they've been there for over 20 years now, but since then, they have survived the turmoil of being in such a young league. And as we get further into the 2000s, more teams would see an early exit from being in such a young league, while others would find their footing and become key pieces in the years to come. After the Rockers, Soul, and Fire folded, the league would go from 16 teams to 13, and while the talent of the league was starting to get better, and more importantly, younger, the league went through a bit of a cycle where both teams were being added and subtracted. For example, in 2006, the league would expand again, and Chicago finally got their WNBA team, the Sky. They were one of the first teams in the league to have a completely contrasting color scheme compared to their NBA counterpart, the Bulls. This is because they actually have no association with the team, unlike other franchises with the W. And fun fact about the Sky, Michelle Williams of Destiny's Child and Michael Knowles, Beyonce and Solange's dad, have a minority stake in the team also. The name was inspired by the Chicago skyline, and the sky blue and yellow primary colors were meant to represent a beautiful Chicago day, with the Sears Tower spearheading the logo. As WNBA hoops were reaching Chicago for the first time, they were being played in Charlotte for the last time for the time being. The Sting, as one of the original WNBA teams, were in a really specific situation. Not only did their NBA counterpart leave them in Charlotte for their new home in New Orleans, they had to take on the color scheme and inherited some of the losing ways of their new NBA brethren, the Charlotte Bobcats. Despite having iconic women's players like Dawn Staley don the jersey, loss of revenue and low attendance really did the franchise in, and 2006 will be their last season. Robert Johnson, the co-founder of BET, actually owned the Sting at the time, and they were turning out bad season after bad season. Johnson and the Bobcats ownership group decided they wanted to cut their losses and turn the team back over to the league, and after a short search for new ownership, the Sting ceased operation. There were briefly plans to move them to Kansas City, but in early 2007, the plans fell through and another one of the W's original teams were no more. After 2007 saw the league have another year of an uneven amount of teams, the league would take one step forward and add Atlanta to the fold, but will lose arguably their best franchise in league history. Like the Chicago Sky, the Atlanta Dream were completely independent from the NBA team that played in the same city, in this case, the Hawks. The league was actually hesitant to bring a WNBA team to Atlanta because the Hawks were doing so bad attendance-wise at the time that they weren't confident that the fan base would materialize for the Dream. But a huge effort from an organizing committee in the Atlanta area made the push to get the city their new WNBA team. Ron Terwilliger would become the team's first CEO, and after an online contest to name the team, they landed on the Dream, named for Atlanta native and civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. As the Dream began to play, the WNBA was starting to pick up in some of the league's bigger markets. Chicago and Atlanta were now covered. The league's newest faces were taking over, while the league's original teams were kind of being picked off one by one. Next in line was the league's winningest team and the first ever WNBA dynasty in the Houston Comets. The team with the most history and arguably the league's greatest players were no more even after winning the W's first 4 championships on rosters that featured 3 future basketball Hall of Famers in Cheryl Swoops, Tina Thompson, and at the time the league's greatest player, Cynthia Cooper. The team was a victim of the 2008 recession, and new team owner Hilton Koch wanted to cut his losses and sell the team. It wasn't easy to find a buyer at the time due to the recession, and when one couldn't be found, the league took over the Comets and disbanded them almost immediately. A team that only missed the playoffs 3 times in 12 years was no more, and arguably one of the saddest endings to a once great franchise in all of sports. 2009 would also see the dissolution of the Sacramento Monarchs, another OG WNBA team. The Maloof family, who also owned the Sacramento Kings at the time, were pretty straightforward in not wanting to operate the Monarchs anymore and put all their focus and resources into the Kings. Obviously, by the way the Kings were being ran at the time, you couldn't really tell based on that decision, but they essentially just gave up on the franchise because they felt like it. There's nothing that suggests they were going through any financial problems like other teams, threats of relocation, or any other typical threat to potential folding. They just didn't want to run the team anymore. The Monarchs were one of the more beloved teams in the league and had pretty solid turnout at their games. The league attempted to move the Monarchs to the Bay Area, but those plans ended up falling through too. The Monarchs today are the last team to completely shut down operations, and they put a stamp on a decade that saw a handful of teams meet the worst fate possible. The 2010s didn't see any teams fold, but it did see a handful of relocations and rebranding. To start the decade, the Shock, one of the league's first expansion teams all the way back in 1998, were on the move to Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Shock had built a nice history in Detroit, forming their own dynasty in the mid-2000s, winning the WNBA championship in 03, 06, and 08. The team struggled in their last few seasons though, both on the court and financially, and it was a perfect storm that culminated in the team's move. Not only did they lose out on $2 million in their last year in Detroit in 2009, Shock and Pistons owner Bill Davidson passed away that March. To make matters even worse, the city was going through some of its worst financial times in modern history that resulted in an economic shutdown of Detroit. Oklahoma had actually been in the running for a WNBA franchise, and a successful bid by local investors of the Tulsa Hoops LLC would have their request granted, and the league would move the Shock to Tulsa, keeping the name but changing up the color scheme a bit. The Tulsa Shock would only last in Oklahoma for a grand total of 6 years, only having 1 playoff appearance and 1 winning record, which would both come in their last season in Tulsa. Majority owner Bill Cameron decided it was best to move the team to Dallas to capitalize on new financial opportunities and called it a difficult decision despite the Tulsa community wanting to keep the team. The Shock would become the Dallas Wings, referring to the wings of the mythological Pegasus, but connecting to the city, it refers to the Magnolia Oil Company logo that sat atop of Dallas's first ever skyscraper. And as of today, the most recent original WNBA team to make a significant move was the San Antonio Silver Stars, formerly known as the Utah Stars. In 2014, they dropped the silver from their name to become the Stars, and 4 years later in 2018, WNBA basketball in San Antonio would cease to exist completely, at least for now. Spurs Sports and Entertainment put the team up for sale in 2017 and were almost immediately bought by MGM Resorts with the intention of moving the team to Vegas. They'd only be the second ever team of the Big Four sports to play in Las Vegas after the Vegas Golden Knights of the NHL began play in 2017. A'ja Wilson would become their first ever pick in 2018, which helped the team's move be as seamless as possible, as she almost immediately became one of the league's best players. The Aces were obviously named after the casino culture within the city, and with the red, gold, and black color scheme, it was one of the more perfect relocations the W could have ever imagined. Raiders owner Mark Davis would buy the team in 2021 and would soon become one of the league's best and most popular teams. Led by Wilson and former Silver Stars legend and head coach Becky Hammon, the team would win the 2022 and 23 WNBA championships. The team would also have a rebrand to silver and black in 2024, matching the Raiders color scheme, but you also have to be reminded of their former Silver Stars days. The 2010s maybe had the least amount of moves when it comes to relocation and teams just not existing anymore, and the early 2020s have been pretty quiet on that front too. The second half of the decade though, it looks like the league is about to go through a much awaited expansion era, and we're about to see new teams in new places and the possible revival of original WNBA teams. The Golden State Valkyries hold the honor of the first expansion franchise in almost 20 years and are the first team to play in the Bay Area, as they are the sister team to the Warriors. They were announced back in 2023 and began play in 2025 and were named after the fearless warrior women known as the Valkyries of Norse mythology. The league is also expanding to Toronto, as the Tempo were announced in 2024, and Portland is getting a second chance to rekindle the flame from their old WNBA life, bringing back Fire as the name of the expansion franchise. Both teams will begin play in 2026 and bring the league's team total back to 15. Philly, Detroit, and Cleveland are also stated to get WNBA teams over the next few seasons, with Philly being a first-timer and Detroit and Cleveland getting a second chance. The WNBA isn't even 30 years old yet, but its era of expansion and stability looks like it's finally on the horizon, and I hope that we can see all these teams live on to build some sort of history in the long run. The W's history of expansion, relocation, and folding is similar to other leagues, but to see it happen in a modern setting is really interesting to watch play out. But I really hope y'all enjoyed this one. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.